We chased the cows out and started planting vines in 2000. While we're still a new vineyard, we've actually been here for a little while now. One of the things that we learned when we were going to vintners that we were fans of and had associations with or knew back in California, which is obviously where I'm from, we talked a lot with Ridge and Ridge Vineyards. And one of the things that one of the ideas they introduced us to early on was the idea of very tight control over your wine fractions. Mm-hmm. So you've got your free run juice, which is predominantly what comes out of a tank unpressed, and then you've got different characteristics coming out as you go through your different press fractions. That in combination with also looking about what we liked about different Bordeaux blends, left bank versus right bank, in terms of what those are generally regarded in terms of the blending component levels. Mm-hmm. So when we took those two together, we decided to create 3 different blends. Destinée, which is dominated by the free run fractions, so therefore we can make the most of it because that's what we have the most of in the blending process. And we were more interested in something that was probably a little bit more right bank in terms of composition. We wanted to see some higher percentages of Merlot. So there's always a higher percentage of Merlot and Cabernet Franc and Malbec. When we moved towards Mistay, we really wanted to start looking more towards the left bank. And so it's generally always about 50, 60% Cabernet Sauvignon. But now we also start digging into those press fractions because we find that there are some more interesting characteristics that come through, a little bit more licorice, anise sort of characters, things that we see, difference in those press fractions. And we're able to get very good press fractions because we do so much sorting prior to anything getting into the tank. So, very, very tight control on sort of almost berry by berry sorting when it comes into fruit receival at crush. And then finally with Magna Premia, a Cabernet dominant blend, usually 70% and upwards for the Cabernet, and really digging into some of those better, more developed press fractions that we see. But as a result, we can only make about a couple hundred cases of it. So all 3 wines are different. They have different styles, but they all come from the exact same batches. So it's not like one comes from a different part of the vineyard. All the same components are in there. It really is a question of how they were blended and put together.
So from a consumer's point of view, by nature of the blend, but also the press fractions, the Destinée is probably more approachable in youth.
Yeah.
And then the Magna Premia, you need quite a bit of bottle aging time to be able to enjoy it as most mature, basically. And that is certainly what you see here in the 2008s in particular. The Destinée, still loads of fruit there, but showing probably more evolution, even than the Magna Premia and the Mistay, which are much more structured styles. You see a lot more tannin backbone, some more freshness and the acidity coming in there. Whereas with the Destinée, it's nice to drink right now.
This is the wine that I'm drinking right now.
Yeah.
A lot of, for personally, if I'm going to, a dinner with friends or something like that, the Destinée 08 is, I'm digging into our library stocks on that one. So
yeah, it's just lovely right now. The oak on the Magna Premia, just standing out a little bit more on that and on the 2010 as well. Probably needs a little bit more time just to marry in a little bit better, which it will. Given a few more years in bottle, whereas you don't really get that on the Destinée or the Mistay, where they're, everything's sort of knitting together nicely at the moment. Let's move on to 2010 because 2010 is an exciting year. It's maturing more slowly, even though it is a younger wine than the 2008. It seems to have a lot of vibrancies to it.
yeah.
Still, even in the Destinée here. So there's a lot of primary fruit still there. And a lot of that sort of grainy structure as well, kind of holding it up. And yet it's just starting to unfold a little bit of what it's got to give. Clearly a very good vintage for you, the 2010, was it?
2010 was, we thought 08 was a great vintage, and then 10 just kind of changed the entire way we thought about what we could see come out of the vineyard and what the vines would produce and what kind of characters would come through. The fruit is very vibrant, which I think is characteristic of just how hot and excellent the ripening, the post-veraison ripening season was. So really good tannin development, just a lot of intent. For me, there's just a lot of intensity there. And for me, this is really exciting, I think, because, it is still, a very young wine. I think that this one is, personally, I'm really excited to see where this wine goes. I think in another couple of years, you can really start to see more of those bottle characteristics bottle aging characteristics come through, a little bit more of the, developed, and I think, that fruit's going to pull back a little bit.
New Zealand obviously isn't known for producing great Bordeaux varietal wines. And there are, let's sort of admit it, there's not a lot that's produced here, and that's because of the ability to ripen those varieties to such a degree where they produce real greatness. And yet you have something unique here on Waiheke. You can produce, consistently ripe grapes, so that they show the vintage variation. But then you have extraordinary years like the 2010, 2012 is pretty special too. But then the 2013 is like wow.
Yeah.
And this is pretty unique.
I think New Zealand as a whole has played around with Cabernets and Bordeaux varietals for a very long time, and now I think the wine industry here in general has gotten their grasp on where the places to grow. Where do you grow Cabernet, and where do you grow Pinot, or where do you grow Sauvignon Blanc, or some of the other varieties that New Zealand is known for. And so I think what's happening now is the people that are doing it, like ourselves, that are pretty focused and special on it, have found the right way to work with the environment, the New Zealand sun and climate, and really start to maximize that. And I think we'll never be a huge producer in New Zealand of Cabernet blends, but there will be a few of us here. I think will be able to consistently produce some great Cabernet based wines.
I have to say that Miss Day 2010 in particular, that's just looking so special. It's still very young, still got a lot of time to go there. But the expression of fruit and the tannin and the balance that's been achieved on that wine is just extraordinary.
We make a lot less Magna Premia, and therefore it carries the highest price of our wines. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best wine for any one person. It's a very personal thing, but for me, in some vintages, Miss Day ends up being my favorite blend.
I was going to say, with the Magna Premia from the 2010, it's gone into a little bit of a mute phase. It's a little bit closed at the moment. It's hard to look at.
Yeah.
It's going through a little bit of a clumsy stage as well, with the oak still poking out, and the aromas and flavors are a little bit shut down and things like that. That's absolutely natural, particularly with Bordeaux blends, that they go through a little phase like that where they're a little bit clunky and they're not showing their best. And they usually give them a few more years and they come shining out of that. Everything starts to marry in, the aromas and flavors open out again.
With the Magna Premia, it can be a little interesting that way, and I think I just think that's got to be the Cabernet and the really high proportions of Cabernet, because we've never released a Magna Premia with less than 70% Cabernet Sauvignon. So I think it's what makes the wine really interesting, and it does make it quite different sometimes than Miss Day and Destiny, which is what we were hoping to do with it.
And then we come to the current release of 2012. Tell me what that was like as a vintage.
What we saw was pretty good flowering of fruit set early on, and a pretty, what I would consider to be a normal vintage through Veraison. And then coming into the tail end of the season, there was a little bit of rainfall, a little bit more rainfall than we've seen in some of these other years. And what we found is that there was a little bit, that can actually have an interesting effect where it can actually sometimes accelerate Cabernet ripening. And so what we saw was a little bit more advanced Cabernet characteristics that would be what I would traditionally sort of push towards the, almost going more towards not jammy, but a little bit more on the developed side, sort of moving more towards those very ripe Cabernet characteristics coming through. So it's a really interesting vintage, and I think it's quite unique compared to some of the other vintages in its style. And so but it was challenging at the end because it did cool off quite a bit. Fortunately, we're lucky enough here to be able to usually get in a little bit earlier than a lot of other vineyards, so we were able to kind of get in ahead of the weather before it had cooled off significantly.
What I really like about 2012 It shows off the site. It shows off the vintage. You've got great fruit going on in there, and that probably also has a lot to do with your stringent selection process. But it also sort of seems like you, as a winemaker, are really getting into your groove here, because there's a lovely harmony there in terms of the winemaking, the extraction, the expression of fruit there. Because the vintage itself probably isn't as exciting as 2013, but what you've done with it is just beautiful. And then we come straight into 2013 after that, which is a glorious vintage.
Yeah.
And it clearly shows in the fruit that you're tasting there, but also in the way that you've expressed it there. There is a concentration there, and almost like the volume turned up on the fruit flavors as opposed to the winemaking there. And you've got this wonderful. I know these wines are incredibly young; they haven't even been bottled yet.
Yeah.
And they're almost like puppies. They're so exuberant, showing off all of this expression at the moment. So it's a little bit of a funny place for a critic to be looking at them. And yet still there's just so much, underlying potential in those wines to be real blockbusters that will go on and on.
Yeah, 13 was, it wasn't actually a great fruit set. For us, that doesn't necessarily play a huge part, but it does, it might give us an extra week or two ahead of the curve than what we might normally inflict upon ourselves. And then carrying through, it was a drought year in New Zealand. It was a terrible year to be a dairy farmer and a great year to be a winemaker. It was the greatest drought conditions we've seen since we've been here at Destiny Bay. But the other thing that I think is a big factor in the 2013 vintage is you're looking at vines that are now approaching 14 years of age. And like when vines are young, I sort of see them as being kind of like a puppy, like they require a lot of attention. Like you can get them to do good things and you can get great things out of them, but it's hard work. Like you've got to be there on top of it. They're a bit unruly, they're sort of like an unruly child that doesn't control itself. So viticulturally, you have to intervene a lot. There's a lot of canopy management. There's a lot of vine, almost vine by vine management. By the time, what we really started to see in 13 was that the vines, like something gaining maturity, they started taking care of themselves more. So we didn't have to manage as closely as we had to in the past. And where that really came up was in the drought conditions, when everybody else was getting concerned about drought, and we were starting to say, okay, do we need to look at and be concerned about water stress as a negative impact on vine physiology and ultimately the fruit? And it was obvious. Dan, the vineyard manager, and I sat there when it was bone dry, and we looked out there, and you could tell that the vines were perfectly happy, that there wasn't an issue of water stress, that you eventually sort of get to know your vines and your vineyard, and you can tell when they're happy and everything is sort of in harmony, and that the vines are doing well and not overly vigorous and not stressed, and they just looked like they were in that sweet spot, and it carried right through to the end, and that's I think that was a real interesting thing about 13, because it did feel like from the vineyard it was kind of a watershed moment, so to speak, although it was in the form of drought, albeit.
Brilliant tasting. Very excited about the recent releases here, the 2012 and next year's release, 2013. And think you're doing an amazing job here.